Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for a special discussion of the Netflix original documentary series, Immigration Nation. This is an event jointly presented by Outside the Box Office, the Latinx Film and Media Association, and Ideas. And we'll be joined by series creators and executive producers, Christina Clusiau and Shaul Schwarz, and executive producer and SCA alumnus Brandon Hill. When we get to open up the Q&A to all of you out there, please just put your questions in the Q&A box. And as we have time, we'll try and invite each one of you over to ask your question live and turn on your mic and turn on your video. So if you'd like to do that, just make sure to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. So thank you all so much for hopping online with us tonight.
It's great to be here. Yeah.
Thanks thank you for having us.
I've been hearing so much about this series from Brandon for quite some time. So I was really excited to actually get a chance to see this, especially knowing that, you know, the work that you guys have done before has always been really provocative and daring in the documentary field, and that putting those talents towards immigration and specifically getting embedded with ICE agents was going to be really something unique. And I think the show really touches on an amazing variety of the experiences that, you know, immigrants and Americans are dealing with in terms of the law and the ethics involved in immigration in the United States. And I'm curious, because you have so many different ways of approaching the subject, what the first kernel was for how this series was going to be produced. I mean, was there one specific thread, or was it always kind of an all-encompassing idea?
Sure, do you want to? So I think initially, because the way we were able to, we felt that it was very interesting to be able to look at immigration from inside the immigration system, whether it be enforcement and the bureaucracy around it. And so I think that's really kind of the gist of how we wanted to create and to use the broad strokes. And because we had really unique access to ICE from the very beginning, we were able to use that as a way to kind of shape the series and thematically about looking at what policies were changing and what things were coming into effect throughout, you know, the first 6-7 months of the administration. And from that, we were able to look at the system from the inside, not only from ICE, but also from immigrant stories. And that's what kind of guided us through as to where it was taking us around the country, looking in New York, looking in the southern border, looking in the middle of the country. But it was always through the access to ICE that kind of was the first stop.
So if I can add to that, effectively what had happened, we wanted for a while to do a show as ICE. I had a connection from almost 10 years ago, but they never kind of let us in. But once Trump came into power, we were able to convince them that they're going to come under a lot of heat and it'd be interesting to let someone in. And once that kind of came to fruition, what had happened is ICE started introducing us to different offices. And basically me and Christina and some other shooter, but predominantly me and Christina in the beginning would kind of go to these different offices and just give it a feel and really see the openness and try and basically set up this different ins into the system. And once we kind of found our key spots, we would work it in the way Christina's calling it inside out, meaning we would try to meet the immigrant stories and tell the stories of this big policy, but also kind of put a human face on it, almost all through like inside the system, because it's really, they've never really let anybody before. It's kind of a very quiet, secretive agency, if you will. And from the get-go, we kind of thought about this wire-like look at the huge system. But that was always kind of our driving force to use the uniqueness to find, and as policies were changing, we would say, you know, this policy, we have an amazing access at this El Paso detention center to, let's say, children's separation. So this is where we're able to meet the dads, and now we would like stay for about a year or two with the story. But it was all kind of built in this like, let's get into the system, find the uniqueness, and then work inside out.
It's kind of astonishing, actually, that it was only during the Trump administration when, as you mentioned, they're going to get extra scrutinized by the public and the press, that you got access. You would think that it would be the reverse, that the sort of the good intentions of the prior administration may have promoted transparency, whether or not it was that. But that this administration that goes as far as the child separation policy would actually be the one to let cameras in. And I'm curious if you could go in a little bit further into that, because there are moments in this series where, I mean, there's even one specific moment where one of the ICE agents says, you ask, like, does he know that this phone call is being recorded? And he says yes, and he shouldn't have said that. And not him, but the person on the call. And the idea, there's a brazenness to it, I guess, from the agents, like wanting to be filmed. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that dynamic of having the cameras, knowing that there's going to be extra scrutiny, and having access at a time when the immigration laws were going to get really inhumane.
Yeah, look, we came to ICE. Like I said, I had a relationship with a spokesman that I'd worked with priorly in 2011. And I tried a couple of different ways back in 2016 and in 2018 to kind of tell him, well, you let me do the drug side, which is less a heated topic. What can I do the immigration side? And I think the way he was thinking about it is nobody's really complaining hardcore. Why would you let two nosy journalists start running around? Like, I could see why he would see it as a lose, almost, because they weren't under that much fire. Yes, Latino communities were calling Obama the deporter-in-chief. He deported a lot of people, but really, immigration is always a hot kind of issue, but there was not that much heat against ICE. I think the Trump rhetoric in the campaign brought so much heat that, we went to Washington, D.C., that February, a couple of weeks after Trump gets into power. And we basically, part of our pitch was like, look, people are going to be upset now. Like, you guys, people didn't know what ICE is. Suddenly, when even for the meeting, there was like people protesting outside the building. So I think they had a little bit more of a reason as kind of a leadership spokesman to say, well, if we could get a fair shake, maybe there'll be a downside, but there'll be an upside. And we told them, look, you're in a hard position, which I actually think is very true. This is a police force like no other enforcement agency. It drastically shifts extremely quickly when political powers change, usually, especially in this one. So I think that was kind of their motivation to do that. Now, that's a very different perspective from kind of boots on the ground people, because really, I think when we got to meet people, it was more like a very classic way of how you build trust with a subject. We spend so much time with these people, and we're curious by nature. I think if you're going to be a journalist or a documentary filmmaker, like, you have to bring your curious hat always on and try to understand the other and think in every possible way and that's what we did kind of every day. So I think with the people in the field, we had a very strong connection, and we would start documenting this effect of how heated the rhetoric has become, because when the policies shifted, especially, it was a tactic to install fear, but especially when children's separation hit, the agency felt this hate that was just unprecedented before. And hate is a funny, strange feeling. Nobody likes to be hated, and we were already inside. And so there was this, how you deal with that. And I think we're very lucky to have gotten a really, not just a very intimate peek, but like an intimate peek in a very unique time to a place that you don't normally get it. And we are really grateful, no matter what happened with ICE later, to those human relationships, if that makes sense. I think that's like the key to almost, to us, I think, right? I would say that's like the most important thing, in like that your characters really, you have this back and forth of trust, and you're able to see everything, even when it's not comfortable, and kind of poke around.
And I think too, just to add to that, I think because of this period of time and the policies were shifting so quickly, you know, you started to see officers that have a very wide range of opinions. And, you know, you always tend to find common ground with individuals, especially like when you're trying to work intimate relationships with them. And a lot of times you don't agree with what they believe, and sometimes you do. But I think what we saw is that under this administration, that this tactic of installing fear and the emboldenedness to expand their mandates to not just go after egregious felons, to go after actually expanding who is removable, such as anybody that is here illegally in the country, you start to see kind of that attitude a little bit trickle down. And I think some agents, you know, felt like their handcuffs were off and they were able to do their job like they couldn't do the last 8 years. And now that they're able to do so, and they liked it, but then others really grappled with it on a daily basis. And I think it's something to note as a lot of these agents were ICE officers under the last administration, they're ICE officers under this one, and they're probably going to be ICE officers under the next administration. And so I think for them, these changes also are very effective, and it takes a toll, and they have to kind of figure out where they belong. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they always are. The common refrain is, "I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing my job."
Mm. Brandon, tell us a little bit about your involvement. You know, I know that you guys have all worked together before, and Brandon, you've done a lot of work in television. How did you see this as a sort of structured 6-part story, given the fact that you know there's at a certain point times in which the narrative does switch away from central characters. Some go from one episode to the next, but then we don't see them again. So that it's not exactly episodic. There is, you know, definitely episodes that have overlap, but there's so many different stories. It's sort of unusual in that way.
Well, I mean, I think I would leave that part to Shaul and Christina, since they were in the Bay making those decisions. And I think what's interesting there for you guys is the difference in making a feature documentary versus making television, right? When you're trying to get somebody engaged over 6 hours and you're telling this story, it's a very different beast than telling that story within a feature doc. And then also I think you know, and Shaul and Christina, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, you're used to working very independently, right? You make your film, you have supporters like impact partners, which leave you alone, and they're very much supporting director-driven projects where you do what you want, you control the IP, they trust you. And TV is a little different in that there's a little more of a give and take between the network and the creative, right? I think that Netflix actually was pretty good, and they did give the kind of the distance and the space that Shaul and Christina needed to make the project. And so really on this one, we served more of a practical role as a producer, right? Because in my opinion, when you're a producer, your job is to really help make the project happen, and whatever that might be, and it's different for everything that you do. And in this case, you know, Shaul and Christina, for all intents and purposes, were the main producers and creative forces on this, right? So they not only were shaping the vision, but they were forging those relationships and kind of building that over time, which is a tremendous, tremendous amount of work. And I imagine the stress of having to manage all that and balance it must have been insane at points. And so we were there to kind of provide logistical support in certain areas. So we helped shape the creative in the beginning when we first started seeing initial footage, which was just astonishing. We were looking at that footage, we're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so we worked with them to kind of put together basically a trailer, right? Because when you're lucky enough to have that initial footage, and Shaul and Christina had received some initial funding from impact partners that they were able to go out and shoot, we put together essentially a 10-minute piece that kind of showed what the intentions and the tone of the series was, right? And we already had a relationship with Netflix from the series that we did last year, the gene editing series, Unnatural Selection. And so that kind of seemed to be where everyone wanted to go, but we still wanted to make sure that what we put out there was something that they could not say no to, right? Just because the filmmaking is incredible, that it's a great team, and then the access, I think, is just something that it's not going to be repeated. It really was amazing. And then, you know, during production, we would kind of help out with the budget and stuff like that. And I guess the backstory is that Shaul and Christina started their own production company, which I think is very smart, right? But there's a difference between like when you're like, you have a production company that's kind of a name only, or where you actually are responsible for the production. They're very different beasts. And on Unnatural Selection, the gene editing documentary, we kind of took the lead in terms of managing legal and financial and stuff like that. And on this one, Real Peak, which is Shaul and Christina's company, came in and took that over. And so they were responsible entirely for that production, which is it's a tremendous responsibility in any TV production, but on this one I think it was particularly it was tough from a legal side.
A little more than we wanted.
yeah, which I'm sure they can tell you about as we go on. So we were just kind of filling in those gaps and making sure that they were supported so that they had everything they needed to realize their vision, right? And then in the end, we came in and we did like the finishing and stuff like that. So we did, coloring and delivering to Netflix, which is super complex. And I think that was helpful too, because rather than because we all have all that stuff in-house for our own productions, right? But Shaul and Christina, because delivering this thing, there was a question at a certain point as to whether or not it was going to air, right? I mean, it got to that point, which you'll see in the New York Times article that they did. It really was contentious at the end. So I think we were able to give them that flexibility to say, hey, let's work on episode 6 right now and not worry about episode 1. And then even when we delivered stuff to Netflix, we were still ready to swap stuff out in case there was any legal reasons or anything like that something couldn't be shown, because that was still being negotiated. So we were just kind of filling in those places as they were going along to support them to make the project. That really was our role.
Wow, there's a lot to discuss there. And
yeah.
I mean, because there's so many different facets of this, I almost feel like I need to compartmentalize the things I want to ask you. I just want to go back to this thing about the access that you had and then the legal issues, because in the course, I'm assuming, of making this, we then had that national crisis with the child separation.
Early on, yeah.
And I'm curious how that affected your production, because, and if that's sort of what you guys are alluding to in terms of the really difficult component of this to get it aired, or if that had more to do with the immigrants you were recording and documenting.
No, during the entire production, we actually had a really good relationship with DHS and ICE. They allowed us to kind of do our thing with some oversight and some communication of where we would go throughout the country. And like we mentioned kind of before, there's like certain areas that we would be able to actually have go to the field offices, for example, in El Paso, and really work within the detention center there. And there was other places like California where a lot of the ICE officials just didn't want anything to do with it because of the culture and the climate there already. They were saying that, we don't even tell our brother-in-law or our mother what we do for a living. So I think there was kind of this sentiment around the country that we picked places where we felt like we had a really good in and access, and we developed relationships from within. And so even through family separation, we were able to be within the detention center when it was unfolding in front of camera. And so we were seeing individuals such as the fathers you see in the series at the point in time where they actually had been separated and they hadn't know where their children were. And they were basically traumatized. And so that was actually all really great. What had happened at the end is when the review process came, because we have what's called a multimedia agreement with DHS, which is a standard agreement usually that productions companies will sign with working with a governmental entity. They were allowed review on the cuts and review for factual inaccuracies, law enforcement sensitive information, and anything that was like privacy, Fourth Amendment rights violations. But what ensued is that when we showed them the initial cut, the very first episode, it was very clear that they were not happy with how they were portrayed. And so through that, they began to ask for more than just those 3 things, to editorialize the content. They wanted things taken out. And so we were able to very successfully, because of the resources we had and the support we had, push back on those. But for a while, it was quite a discussion happening, because they figured that the show would be much more favorable to them. In reality, we really held an ear up to what we saw, and they didn't like it so much. So that's kind of where
that legal battle that Christina got to in the end, that kind of happens over a couple of months as we're trying to close the show, as COVID hits and we can't go to LA, we're New York based to finish the show, and our editors and our whole office is all collapsed to remote. And it kind of all hits us together, this legal fight, this need to deliver to Netflix on time, this how do we do everything from afar, from locking the cuts to finishing legal to how do you do color to all these things kind of. So it was a very challenging time. And certainly, you know, when you are challenged legally, it's always hard at this end stage because you're so deep in the cut that anything you need to remove or change affects so much. But when you're facing, you know, a law enforcement agency at the top level and you're kind of get pushback from spokesmen that are, you know, linked to the White House and such, and it was rough. It was a very hard time to kind of stand our ground and understand really which parts are in danger and what the fight is and how to finish certain parts like Brandon was saying and not others, and just kind of navigate this whole machine. And weirdly enough, being stuck in our kitchen in an apartment, not in an office surrounded by people that you can jump around and kind of see people.
So considering the things that you actually do have in here that don't necessarily give you a favorable impression of ICE, though to some extent it does give you an honest impression of individual people that work for ICE, what general category of thing were they fighting back against?
Yeah, I'll give you, so what had happened is, you know, the first episode came, I'll use it just as an example, and they kind of asked for a lot more than what they're allowed to. And some they would say, you have a First Amendment right to do it, but please remove, it's not us, it's not representative, which was not so true. And some they kind of started inventing these really lame, to be honest, legal ideas of why we should that. And as we pushed back, that list of legal got longer. And I'll give you an example. We won't go too much into the nitty gritty, and a lot of this is obviously sensitive. But there's a scene in episode 1 where a team of ICE goes into a house and they take what's called collateral arrest. It's not their target. It's people who have just broken immigration law. And, you know, of course, they see that as unfavorable, although the administration has proudly signed that as an executive order. And so in that house, we had this part of the scene was that the agents had this fingerprinting machine, and the immigrants go and kind of put their thumb on it. And so, and it's just a tiny example, but there was hundreds of like this. But DHS said, well, you're not allowed to show that. Please remove the whole scene. Which A, why the whole scene? And B, we were like, that's really weird because we thought it was out there. So Christina proceeded to Google. And not only that the device was shown in a lot of newspapers and was mentioned, we later saw that DHS, the same spokespeople we are dealing with, released a statement and a picture of that device when they got it 2 years earlier. So, you know, obviously we pushed back on that drop, but, you know, at a different time, they said when people are talking about the president, that's a violation of something called the Hatch Act, which is a Cold War, height of Soviet kind of day that government's employees cannot work to flip the government. You know, when our lawyers saw that, they were like, are they out of their mind? It doesn't make any sense. So obviously there was like this, I'm giving you examples, but there was these patterns of things that that didn't make sense. And we, of course, pushed back. But, you know, when something is so sensitive, you do have to consider point by point, and this whole thing got dragged. It wasn't anywhere the process we expected to. And as we pushed more, they also pushed more, and it's hard to fight. You know, we were let know that this is coming from a top, and the fight was pretty intense for us.
What's fascinating to me is that in addition to the sort of on the ground ICE agents. You also have like the ICE PR guy. I don't know what better way to refer to him. I'm sure there's a title that I missed, but you know,
No.
this guy whose like job is to go out and basically spread the policy in a way that that won't necessarily, I guess, come down unfavorably on the administration or on the law enforcement agency. So seeing him say things in this that he probably should not have had recorded is kind of astonishing. What did he think he was getting into by agreeing to be in this?
I mean, I think he understood that we had like vast access throughout the country. And I think he understood that, you know, I think he likes to be on camera. He likes to talk about the role of ICE in different facets. And so I think that was something that we were drawn to because we thought it was so interesting how an individual, a public affairs office, how they speak about what they're doing on a public level, and how you can actually, we had more access to him than just, you know, his like on TV speeches. And so we thought that was really interesting.
He wasn't careful, let's say it that way. Brian Cox, I think, to be honest, like, I think people as comments like really hate him. To me, I was fast. I kind of almost like him just because I like the character. When you're in a production, a film, you know, you tend to like the complexity of the character, to me, of this guy that's kind of neat and clean and has to jump from place to place and kind of piss on this fire and try to walk a line here and there. It was so interesting. We actually had a lot more material, and I think we caught up to what a good character he is a little late in the show, where we would have worked almost more through him, because there was something so interesting in having the access to see the reality, having to see how the general public perceives it, and then having this guy needing to do this impossible task of explaining and walking and hearing what the Miller office and the White House wants it to look like, and how he's going to kind of explain it. And I think it's almost a character we see in fiction, but actually witnessing that
was pretty incredible.
Was pretty incredible. And yeah, to his, he always, even when it wasn't interesting, I remember the first time we met him, he went on this call and we were kind of shocked at how open he was, and he was talking to all of ICE PR. They have this like weekly calls that they all brief each other. And he wore a mic, and I thought he would say, "Hey, the Netflix crew is here, by the way. Does anybody mind, or tell me when not to?" And he just kind of did it. You know, we didn't use that call because I don't think it's right, but it was like something dropped in my head, and I said, "Wow, this guy's a spokesman. That's his job, and he's just kind of letting us do it." And I think he is truly kind of a fascinating guy. We always, through this, we would always joke of the fiction we would write, and Brian Cox certainly would be a lead character.
Yeah, he really believed like the public, he wanted things to be in the public. And so he wanted his, you know, the way that he speaks about things going on to come from him. And so other people did get the perception that was not really true. And the way that he did it was pretty amazing.
So in terms of other stories that you follow, there's sort of like three branches, I find. There's the activists, the people whose human rights they're advocating for, and the structure and system that they're fighting against. And I'm curious if there was any mistrust from any of these camps that you were filming with the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was always a very precarious balance. You know, I think especially when we started working in North Carolina, that was the hardest thing. Is because it's a little bit different when you're filming with ICE and you're also filming a detainee or somebody that's detained, because you are with ICE, but yet ICE is allowing you to film with the detainee, and you can make a very clear case of the separation. That, you know, yes, we're here at the, you know, ICE let us in, but we actually want to tell your story. But when it got to be in North Carolina, when it was really separating of keeping two teams on the ground to watch the interaction happen, it became very tricky, because you wanted to walk that line not to inform each other and keep on doing the project that you were doing. And so Stephanie eventually, you know,
both sides knew to some degree that we're maybe with others, but you have to keep I'll give you very practical examples. ICE calls us and tells us, you have 36 hours to get here, we're going to react, and there's going to be an enforcement. We understand that the activists have been waiting for this, but we can't tell them, but we actually want to film them when this goes down. How do you handle that? And then suddenly you have two shooters there, and they're communicating among themselves, and they're each riding with each side, but they have to hold that information while you're trying for each side to fully trust you. And it's hard, and you have to constantly kind of ask yourself how to not cross the lines, because we are journalists, we can't choose sides, we have to not mess up anything that's operational. And even the very basic thing, when we started working with ICE in New York and we would knock on the door, I would, I speak Spanish, but it's far from perfect. And I would have to every time kind of in these really, 6 o'clock in the morning, someone's knocking on the door to take your relative. This is like intense moments. And I would have to immediately separate from this ICE group and very strongly tell the person, look, we're independent journalists. You don't have to let us in, but we would really love to document what is going on. And, try to say it in a way that on one hand, the immigrant will let us in the door. And on the other hand, these ICE agents, which I'm going to roll with tomorrow and the next day won't hate me because I'm not pushing too far. And there's always these weird lines there. And, it gets very emotional. So it was a very challenging production. But I think that's what made us so fascinated to constantly need to handle all these sensitivities. And I got to give ICE, at least on the agent side, some credit that they kind of understood it. And obviously, just to make something clear, like we got a lot more no's than yeses. But once we got a yes, and it was interesting and it was real, we would really try to follow through. And sometimes those yeses that came in really traumatic moments, we made sure to recheck in. I'll give you an example. We follow in episode 3 a deported veteran by the name of Caesar. And we found him through other deported veterans. We didn't know that veterans get deported before doing this show. We thought it was absolutely nuts and bonkers. And then we found this guy who said, no, screw this. I'm from here. I was always here. I'm going to go back. And he's living his life as a fugitive in Las Vegas. And we do a Skype with him and he says, yes, I'm signing on. I want to do the show. And I said, Caesar, I love your story. We're ready to jump in. But you understand that you are taking a risk. You are a fugitive. And we could work with certain elements to kind of protect it, but you're still taking a risk. And he kind of says, Shaul, a Marine never hides. And it was so instinct that I was like, okay. So we filmed with this guy for a couple of weeks, on and off. And I realized that I'm really scared for him. And I love the story. And as directing this, you don't want to spend the next year just to have someone in the end tell you to pull the story. And so I go back to Caesar on purpose next to his wife, and I say, Caesar, you kind of rushed into this. I want you to actually talk to your wife, and I'm not upset if you kick us out now. You're a fantastic story. I think it's fast. And, and then I saw him have this more real discussion of the wins and the loses. And I think those lines are really important. And I've been a journalist for over 20 years. And I think this project tested us like almost nothing in our past, in all these constant, how do you navigate? How do you hold both sides and kind of stay dignified to your work, to the subjects that are, to some degree, are always in a cat and mouse situation?
One of the amazing things that we see in the series is that you follow, because you do follow people from their arrest, potentially beyond that, and there's something so powerful about actually being able to tell that story through the various stages. And yet we also in the media have heard of so many people that get lost in the system, right? Kids that can't be found. I'm curious if that happened to you with anyone that you were following.
All the time.
All the time. I mean, I think it was really important for us for the stories that we did tell and that we were able to complete, that we were able to tell them from inside the system, not just their story of, being detained and deported, but also their child's story, for like Bernardo and Emilio, and then the family back home. And so that in itself logistically was extremely hard, because they were actually one of the easier ones because they had numbers we could call the sister-in-law, we could call Emilio, we could call Rebecca. So we were able to connect to all of them. But I think the beauty and the horror of the system is that it's designed to get people lost within it. Mm-hmm. And there's something that always happens is that, once you get in there, they're moved according to bed space. They're moved according to where their case is at, which area of the country do they need to go to.
They become alien numbers.
They become alien numbers. They're no longer a human within the system. And so it makes it so hard to track people. And even, for example, like with Bernardo, there was a point in time where he was moved to another facility, and we could not call him. There was no way, because we would call him and the facility would say, no, he's in immigration side. You need to call the immigration side. You call the immigration side. No, he needs a prisoner number. And so you look at how easily it was designed to be able to make, us who have resources and the ability to research and look around to be able to find this person. And the reality is that we couldn't. And so I can't imagine family members trying to connect with their loved ones and how tricky it becomes. And you think about even legal representation when you're in detention, there's no internet, there's no way that you can reach out to contact a lawyer other than a list that maybe they give you.
You can also never call the inmate, they can only call you, which makes it very hard.
So things like this, where to track people is extremely difficult. We got lucky in a few cases, but there were many situations where you meet them once, you interview them once, you take down a phone number, but then
and we learned was time to try and immediately connect to as many people in the family, which is also a lot of trust, because you have to remember this person's usually undocumented, and that means his family is a mixed status or undocumented. But we would always try to have multiple connection points so we could track, because we knew that if somebody had one or two calls, they're probably going to call their wife. And how do you gain that? So it was very challenging, but I think it also made it very interesting. And part of that, we a little bit started to feel I think how the families felt. Yeah. Of course, we had more resources, and we had a fantastic researcher that speaks fluent Spanish, and, money to call, and we would tell people to call us, collect, and all that, but still, it was really, really challenging. I think people get lost in the immigration system all the time.
But real quick, just to jump in, I think that dedication to pursue these stories is what makes the series really unique, right? Because if you're able to follow each of these characters and see things through their lens, it gives you a much better understanding of the situation, right? I think, and that's both from a story standpoint and from a filmmaking standpoint. From a story standpoint, the Bernardo stuff is incredible when you see it through, you go to Guatemala and you see his wife's perspective, where she lives, where they're coming from. It's such a richer understanding of who that person is. And I think it, in a weird way, the most incredible thing this series accomplishes, I think it identifies these immigrants as people. I know it sounds weird and simplistic, but it's true. You view, this person has the same wants, desires, needs that I do. And I think that's really important, that connective quality. And then I also think from the filmmaking side, it's really unique. The first edited piece that we saw, I think, was Stephania in North Carolina when she was live streaming the ICE raids, right? And Shaul said, you just have to see this. It's incredible. And, you had cameras with ICE, and then you had a camera with Stephania, and then she was broadcasting it, and then ICE was watching the broadcast, and then they got into almost a car chase, and it was longer in the initial version, and it felt like a Michael Bay movie or something, you know what I mean? And so I think that to be able to accomplish that in a documentary is really incredible, and it didn't ever feel forced, or it was real, you know what I mean? And it was really, really impressive, So I think that dedication to really find access through all parts of the story is what makes this unique in my mind.
And jump onto what Brandon said, I remember really early on when we did the trailer and stuff, Radley would do these really cool graphic treatments and stuff. And some of it was like scratching off, like, and making everybody numbers. And it was really cool. And we got really scared because, like, oh my God, everything we want to fight is that people don't think of these guys as alien numbers. And it takes some guts. If you're going to do that language, you have to dial it back enough to actually explain that it's on purpose. So I think that early trailer stuff that we didn't know what to do with gave us a lot of clarity that if we want to take people out of the shadows, we really have to focus on signing all the legal so we could really show people, being really careful with everything, anybody that's hidden and what's reducted. And then I think as the series came to completion, for example, ICE asked us to reduct the names, and instead of just putting Bob, we decided to put Bob whatever and kind of draw a line on it and start using that as a language of reduction. But there's definitely this feel that people disappear, and it was a hard battle and something we were very consciously like, how do we make them people? So I think you're right, Brandon, that became slowly like a very, very strong fight for us to bring to life.
Well, I want to ask you about one of my favorite moments that does exactly that, which I think is one of the most humanizing moments of the entire series. But before I do that, I just realized that I had disabled the chat earlier for something else that we had done this morning. So my colleague, Jenny, this is more for her. Can you just text me anyone that you're able to ask me to call on, and I'll just keep that open for when we open it up. So for everyone out there, I'll just ask this one question, and then since it's already 6:45, we'll go to audience questions in a second. I feel like we've just started to scratch the surface, but I want to give everyone else a chance. So I'm thinking of, in particular, the call between one of your characters and his wife back, I think in Guatemala. Mm-hmm. And she's kind of teasing him, or is she, about, his need to earn money. And it's such a delicate scene because it's so intimate and personal. And then it's also like, it sounds a little bit like she's like, kind of being playful, but being playful about something very serious. So it sort of really toes this fine line, the way that any conversation like that between, spouses might play out, especially over the phone. So my question is, can you tell us a little bit about getting something that intimate, but then also from a physical production standpoint, how did you handle any of the shooting that was abroad? And was that in real time? I mean,
yeah.
So the abroad was, look, usually we're kind of, we're photographers turned filmmakers, and when it's not such a large scope, we kind of shoot all our own stuff. Mm-hmm. This series was a little different. We had to gain trust in a couple of other shooters and work with them. So there was 3 or 4 other people that we worked with that kind of usually stuck to the same storyline, so there would be trust, because as you can tell, there's a lot of trust issues. In terms of this story, we shot all of it, right?
And it was the 2 of us, and then we had an international local fixer on the ground.
In Guatemala. But that conversation that you are referring to is basically right after Bernardo. We met him during children's separation, and we spent kind of 10 months documenting this family with the whole idea of that, we'd gotten so close to him, this guy would call us all the time from a detention. And I think that was the most, it became obvious that this is not production anymore. He would call my cell phone, and he just needed someone to listen to him. And about 2 months into this, I suddenly had this realization that maybe I could put him on hold and call his wife, Rebecca, who I was in touch with, and just let them chat. Wow. And it was really weird because these guys are truly like, they would be like, hola, mi media naranja, and super in love, kind of. But this guy's in detention, and I'm in the middle listening to this, and sometimes half a production company is kind of like... And so it's a long way to say that we did grow really close to this family, and we understood how each one, the wife, Bernardo in detention and his son that he had to ironically sign off custody to, thinking he's doing a great thing, only to do it a day before Trump would sign the executive order. So all other parents that were separated were let go because of the executive order, but Bernardo was no longer a separated case. He was his own case. So he was in this ironic situation, which is very typical to how broken the immigration system is. And when he finally got out, it still makes me sad. Sometimes we were doing so much, he called me and I wasn't able to grab the phone. And he actually called me to say that he got, like anything at ICE.
It was very arbitrary.
It was completely arbitrary. They suddenly ran out of beds. They didn't know where to move him. And they were like, hey, you, Bernardo, give me an address where you can go to. He's like, I got to call my lawyer. They told me not to tell you anything. They're like, well, if you give me an address, you're on this bus that's leaving in 20. So he was like, this address in Houston. And on the way, he called me and I didn't pick up. So we actually missed the reunification of Bernardo, which we were devastated. But he called as he landed and we rushed to Houston. But this scene happens the next morning. And we knew them all really well. And Bernardo calls his wife, and all the Bernardo I know was, except for being in love with his wife, was a very depressed person. Very dark, a very harsh reality. And we get there and Bernardo's just like, I didn't know he was like that. He's funny. He's like throwing jokes. He's like smiling. It's like a new guy. And he calls his wife and he tells me, I couldn't talk yesterday and I can't wait to see my children because it's going to be the first video chat. And he talks to his kids and it all starts happening. And he's so ecstatic. We think it's just going to be like this beautiful, happy moment. And sure enough, Rebecca turns around to her reality and she doesn't feel this huge thing that he's been released. She's kind of practical and she's like, well, I'm not coming. What are you talking about? Am I going to get separated? How are we going to send money? And it was just so...
You just saw his face go from smiling to sad to like, couldn't believe that this is the first time that he was speaking to his family. And it's just like, you just saw how broken it was and how these two individuals have entirely different realities, but they're so interconnected, and how effective, his detention was to her and how he was just excited to be out. But
Christina doesn't speak Spanish, and I remember just her looking at me and just the intensity of our language of how we cover stuff, and me kind of on the verge of tears between smiles and happiness. And she just knew it was magic, even though she couldn't at the moment understand what was told. And I was just like, it was like my body language. We can't miss like a cutaway of this. Like, let's not F this up. This is like magic. So it's one of these things that in docs, you miss so much and things go broken and you miss that and this, and suddenly something unfolds that you can kind of never script. And that was one of them.
Okay, one last thing, just because it really just dovetails into what you're saying, which is when you form those kind of intimate relationships with people who also are seeking something very tangible, like getting out of detention, how do you grapple with having to say goodbye to them when you're done with production? Because presumably, the presence of cameras may or may not like even affect their case. I don't know if that ever was something that factored into it, but the fact that the cameras are there documenting their experience does have greater visibility as to how they're treated, I would imagine, to some extent. But then having to sort of remove that and step out of their worlds has to be pretty heartbreaking, let alone could have sort of ramifications on what happens to them next.
No, it's a great question. Look, I spoke to Bernardo this morning, so it gives you some characters you don't really. They're still characters. Like, I want to be honest about that. I think after a long time, you get very passionate and very emotional. But there is also a barrier. I think half the things that I saw in my life, not only on this show, if I would have seen without this kind of shield of a camera, I don't know that I could be the same. But you are working, and it is about kind of being very thoughtful and listening and caring, but also professional. And you want to be very straight with people, but I think you also have to go home. You have to, I grew up as a photojournalist in the West Bank, and it would be a motorcycle ride back and back to my home in 5 minutes, but you still have to kind of take that off. And sure, you think about people and you care and you grapple with it. And sometimes it takes a toll, I won't lie. I think, it took a toll on who I've become, and maybe sometimes being angry and upset with things because you see so much and you care. But I think if you're not able as a documentary journalist to somewhat say, okay, this is a line, I've done all enough, I think I'm straight in the edit, I'll be nice to him, but I can't, you're not going to make it. You can't take everybody's, especially when you deal with painful subjects, you can't take everybody's pain as your own or as like your family or a close friend completely and stay okay. Maybe it sounds horrible and cold, but I think it's like there's some some kind of shield, a mechanism that it's not like you become desensitized. I don't want to sound like a jerk, but you have to sort of balance something in there.
And I think for also just to add to that, I think I always want some sort of realization that they're going to be okay, that the individuals that we spend so much time with and tell their story, because you deeply care about the reality of their lives, and you hope that you did right by them, that they feel that they were portrayed accurately to their own story. And I think we were on a call the other day with Deborah and her kids, and they were very excited about the piece. And she said to us, she said, I sat down with the kids this afternoon and I told them, Shaul and Christina did their part. Now it's time to do our part. And I just thought that was like a very conclusive moment for me to be like, she handed it back over. And I think that's always something really interesting with filmmaking and documentary, is that it takes a different form once it's out in the world, and how people interact with it, including your characters and how they perceive themselves and what they do with it. Because really for them, it's a platform to use whatever they want to, however they want to, to continue telling their story. And I think that for me gives me some solace and some calmness that they're okay.
And when you do, because obviously you portray not only people that you only feel good about, it's complicated. So in this show, we had a very hard ending with ICE, but it's not really true to those relationships that actually gave us the access. So, we have been kind of receiving text messages from some of them. We were very afraid to reach out because things got so heated with leadership. And some liked it and some liked it less. The majority was actually kind of relieving because we were so scared of it. But, me and Christina grapple with it. There's an individual that we haven't heard from, and we know she's upset from ICE. And I think I could see why she's been hurt. I think we battle with, maybe that's a mistake we made in the show, that we looked at all this thing. It's not really about her, but she comes across as a little bit not what she is. And you have to live with it. We did it. The cut's out there. I can't say anything to this group or change it, and sometimes that's hard. You have to be gutsy as a director and push buttons, but it's a little bit hard to fully understand. Maybe you get better experience as a director what people will perceive, and when you do hurt people, I think it's painful.
This conversation could probably go on for at least another couple of hours based on the fact that we're still getting questions. But you're on the East Coast. Brandon, you have a child. So I think this is probably a good point for us to thank you and to encourage people to continue sharing Immigration Nation with people globally. I'm assuming Netflix dropped it everywhere. So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us tonight. And we hope to have you back on campus soon.
Thank you very
so
much.
Thank you, Alex.
You guys, thank you. Appreciate it.